The last thing Jaewon remembered about his parents was the smell of his mother's coat, synthetic wool and motor oil, because she wore her lab jacket under everything, even on passenger shuttles. Even on the day they died, he was 7. The shuttle was called the Daesung 4, a mid-range orbital ferry carrying 24 researchers between the Lagrange Relay Station and the Korean Aerospace Institute's low-orbit platform. His father had brought him along as a treat. His mother had pretended to object and then packed his favorite snacks in her coat pocket. He remembered eating a rice cracker when the hull breach happened. A sound like the universe inhaling, and then nothing until he was in a rescue capsule with a blanket over his shoulders and a paramedic holding his hand, and both his parents were gone, along with 19 other people who had families and coat pockets, and rice crackers of their own. Nobody ever figured out what caused the breach. The official report said structural fatigue. His father's colleagues, who ran the institute for another decade and a half before retirement, said they weren't sure. They said it quietly, the way people say things they don't want to be held to. Jaewon had been too young to press them on it, and by the time he was old enough, the people who might have known were gone. He grew up with his father's closest friend and research partner, in a flat in Incheon that smelled of solder and instant noodles, and the particular warm dust smell of electronics left running through the night. Doctor was a large, rumpled man who communicated predominantly through grunts, and who kept 3 ongoing experiments in the kitchen at all times. His wife was patient and funny, and occasionally threw the experiments out without warning, which caused magnificent arguments that neither of them ever meant. Their daughter, Bomi, was 2 years older than Jaewon and treated him with the affectionate contempt of an older sibling. Their son, Chae-dol, was younger and followed Jaewon around like a satellite. Jaewon was not by any standard measure remarkable. He was not unintelligent, Doctor. Saw to his education with the same relentless thoroughness he applied to everything, but he was not gifted in the way his father had been gifted, and he knew it, and he had made a kind of private peace with it somewhere around age 13. He was clumsy in the specific way of people whose minds are slightly ahead of their bodies, always reaching for things a half second before his coordination caught up. He had a habit of losing things, forgetting appointments, and arriving at meetings with the wrong documents, while having somehow also brought the right ones and put them in the wrong folder. He laughed at himself easily because he'd learned that it was easier than waiting for other people to do it. He worked maintenance at Relay Station Orin, a mid-tier orbital installation that served as a signal router and refueling depot between Earth's inner system and the deeper research platforms. It was not glamorous work. The station ran on a skeleton crew of 23, most of whom were either deeply competent and slightly bored, or enthusiastically incompetent and deeply annoying. Jaewon fell into a third category that his supervisor, Chief Engineer Rowe, described as unreasonably effective in ways that are very difficult to document, which meant that when something broke in an unexpected way, Jaewon usually knew how to fix it, but the fix never looked like a fix. It looked like someone had taped the problem back together and kicked it hard. He had been at Orin for 4 years when the first anomaly appeared. It showed up on a standard frequency scan, an irregular signal burst, tight band, no known source pattern. The station's automated systems logged it and filed it under unresolved atmospheric, which was the digital equivalent of a shrug. Jaewon pulled the log out of habit during his overnight maintenance cycle and looked at it for a long time. The signal wasn't atmospheric. He knew that the way he sometimes knew things, not through formal analysis, but through a kind of recognition, the same instinct that told him a relay unit was about to fail 3 hours before the diagnostic caught it. He filed a note in the system. Nobody responded. He filed a second note 2 days later when the signal recurred, stronger and slightly more structured. This time the pattern had something that looked almost like periodicity, not transmission, not communication, but the kind of involuntary regularity that a damaged system produces when it's trying to maintain function, like a heartbeat from something wounded. Chief Rowe told him to stop looking at ghost signals and finish the coolant recalibration on Bay 4. Jaewon finished the coolant recalibration. He also ran a quiet directional trace on the signal in his own time, using the station's secondary array during the 6-hour maintenance window when nobody was monitoring the uplink logs. The trace gave him a bearing, not a precise location. The signal was too faint for that, but a vector. It was coming from the debris field between Station Orin and the inner research platforms. The field was technically off-limits for approach without a mission brief, but it was only about 40 minutes out by maintenance skiff, and Jaewon had checked out the maintenance skiff 17 times this calendar year for various jobs, and nobody had ever asked him why. He told himself he was just going to look. He almost didn't find it. The object was dark and irregular and cold, tumbling slowly in a lazy rotation that matched none of the known debris patterns in that sector. It was about the size of a modest ground vehicle, and it had been there long enough that a thin crust of micrometeorite residue had layered over most of its surface. But underneath that gray crust, when Jae-won brought his skiff close enough to shine the work lights on it, there was a material he had never seen before. Something that was not metal, and not composite, and not anything in the catalog he'd spent 4 years learning. It was the color of deep water. The hatch opened on its own when he was 2 meters away. He nearly panicked. He genuinely considered firing the skiff's maneuvering thrusters and getting out of there, and then writing a very careful report that would probably get him laughed at. He sat for 11 seconds with his hand on the thruster control. Then he thought about his parents, about the Daesung 4, and the hull breach and the paramedic holding his hand. He thought about the official report that said structural fatigue in the voice of people who weren't sure. He went inside. The interior of the vessel was larger than the exterior suggested. Not impossibly so, just the particular surprise of efficient design, the way a well-organized room feels bigger than its square footage. The air that came out of it when the hatch opened was breathable, if stale, with a faint electrical smell that reminded him of Dr. Um's kitchen. Emergency lighting cast everything in a dim amber that made the walls look organic, even though they weren't. There was a being inside. He had imagined this moment the way most people who stare at a soft clear sky eventually imagine it. He had always pictured something more dramatic, cold fire, incomprehensible geometry, a presence that rewrote the air around it. What he found was closer to a person, closer to an old person specifically, a tall, angular figure wrapped in something between a uniform and a survival garment, seated against the curved wall, breathing with the shallow care of someone conserving effort. Its proportions were wrong in ways that took Jae-won a moment to inventory. The torso, too long, the joints occupying different angles, the face possessing a bilaterality that was recognizable as a face, but organized around different priorities. The skin, where it was exposed, was the color of weathered copper. The eyes, there were three, arranged in a slightly convex triangle, were open and focused on him. The being did not move. It said something. Not in a language Jae-won recognized, but in a tone he did, the careful, effortful tone of someone delivering information they believe may be their last chance to deliver it. Then it reached out one long, four-jointed hand and placed it against the side of Jae-won's head before he had time to step back. What happened next was not pleasant. It felt like being struck by lightning from the inside, not the electricity but the light, a total illumination that had no regard for what was already in there. It lasted less than 2 seconds and left Jae-won on his hands and knees with his ears ringing and tears running down his face from the sheer involuntary pressure of it. When he looked up, the being Kael'var, a name that arrived in his mind with the force of a signature, was dead. He stayed in the ship for a long time. What Kael'var had left him was not a power in the popular sense. It was not a transformation, not a switch he could flip. It was more like a second literacy, the way learning a language doesn't change your brain, but suddenly allows it access to structures that were always there. What Jae-won had, when he finally stood up and started to understand what had been given to him, was a comprehensive and detailed awareness of forces that he had always been dimly sensing and never had the vocabulary for: energy states, fields and their interactions, the living physics of matter in ways that his instruments could measure, but his instincts had never been able to grasp. He understood, with a certainty that went past intellectual, exactly how to do things that should have been impossible. He also understood, from the information that had come with the transmission, why Kael'var had come. There was a name, Vreth, and there was a daughter, Lyra, and there was a warning that had arrived too late for Kael'var to deliver in any other way. He brought the ship back to Station Orin carefully, claiming on the check-in log that he had retrieved a piece of debris for materials analysis. The log accepted this without complaint. Jae-won was excellent at paperwork in the same way he was excellent at maintenance, not because he was naturally organized, but because he had learned, through years of small disasters, exactly where the critical points were. He found the girl in the forward compartment. She was approximately his age, or the alien equivalent of it, which he was not equipped to assess. She was upright and awake, and she had been watching him on the internal sensor array since he first entered the ship, and her expression when he found her was the expression of someone who has already decided what they think of the situation and is prepared to be very clear about it. You're the human, she said. It took him a moment to realize she was speaking Korean, not fluently, not naturally, but correctly in the manner of a system that has translated at the grammatical level and left the human idioms behind. I'm a human, he said. There are 8 billion of us. My father chose you. I know. I'm sorry. He's gone. She looked at him for a long time with those copper dark eyes. He chose a maintenance worker. I'm actually quite good at maintenance. Vreth is a Class 7 Imperial aggressor. He has destroyed 4 inhabited systems. He carries a full combat garrison and a flagship that can crack planetary crust. I know. He did know. Kael'var had given him that too, along with everything else. I'm sorry. Do you want to tell me more? Or do you want to start telling me what we can actually do about it? Lyra looked at him with an expression that was not quite contempt, but was definitely adjacent to it. What my father gave you, she said, is a weapon. It requires training. Then we'd better start. She started immediately, which he appreciated, because it meant she had already decided that she didn't have the time to be contemptuous. She was, beneath the armor of distrust, frightened in the specific way of someone who has been responsible for too long. Her father had been a marshal of the Interstellar Enforcement Bureau, a regulatory body from a system 43 light-years distant, closer, in cosmic terms, than Jaewon found entirely comfortable. He had been tracking Vreth for 11 years. He had been wounded 3 months ago in an engagement that had destroyed his ship's main drive and left him tumbling in Earth's outer system, broadcasting the emergency signal on a band that Jaewon's station instruments barely picked up. Jaewon had heard it, because he always listened for things that didn't fit. It was, as far as he could tell, the only qualification Kael'var had needed. The training was painful. Not because Kael'var's gift was dangerous, it wasn't particularly, as long as Jaewon didn't try to deploy it in vacuum without a suit, which Lyra made very clear was a common mistake and had been fatal to 3 Bureau trainees in documented history. It was painful because the gap between knowing how to do a thing and being able to do a thing is always painful to cross, and Jaewon was crossing it in days instead of the years that the Bureau's standard protocol called for. He slept 4 hours a night. He ran the skiff out to the debris field every shift he could spare and worked in 0G because Lyra said that was how the Bureau trained. He dropped things and miscalculated and occasionally bounced off the hull of the ship with a force that left bruises on his ribs, and Lyra watched all of this with the expression of a person who has bet everything on a horse that has just tripped over its starting gate. You are not naturally gifted, she said, on the 4th day, after he had spent 20 minutes trying to hold a coherent energy field steady and produced instead something that she described as resembling a confused jellyfish. Thank you, that's very specific. It's an accurate comparison. You seem to have no sense of economy. I have a great sense of economy. I once fixed a coolant relay with a paper clip and a piece of insulation tape. It lasted 6 months. That's not what economy means in this context. I know what it means. I'm buying time. She looked at him. For what? For the part where I figure out how to make it work anyway. He tried again. This time the field held, not elegantly, not efficiently, but it held, and it held in the shape he needed it. He looked at Lyra. See, confused jellyfish can still sting. There was something in her expression when she thought he wasn't watching that was not quite softening, but was at least less hard than it had been. He noticed it and said nothing, because some things you mention and some things you don't. The 5th day was better, not dramatically. There was no moment of sudden competence, no scene where something clicked, and the ability unfurled in him, like a flag in wind. It was more like the slow progress of any skill built on repetition. The embarrassing things becoming merely clumsy things, the clumsy things becoming deliberate things. He learned how to hold a field without bracing against it. That was the core of what Lyra meant by economy, he realized, not efficiency of energy, but efficiency of intent. You couldn't push the ability like a tool. It didn't push. It responded to the quality of your attention the way a conversation responds to how much you're actually listening. He thought that was interesting. He thought it said something about Kael'var's choice. My father used to say, Lyra said on the 5th evening, when they had docked the Urame back in its hiding spot and were eating the station's standard ration packs in the maintenance bay, because neither of them wanted to explain to the crew why the deputy maintenance lead was sharing meals with a being they hadn't been briefed to expect, that the ability isn't a weapon, it's a perception. The weapon part comes from knowing what you're looking at. He was a marshal. He used it as a weapon. He used it as a tool that could be weaponized. Different thing. She ate with the careful, methodical attention she gave everything, taking each item in the ration pack in a specific sequence that Jaewon had begun to recognize as a preference rather than a protocol. He could hold a hull breach sealed from the outside once, not for long, but long enough. That's J1 thought about the Daesung 4. That's an interesting capability. He was trained in emergency extraction. It was one of 3 techniques he demonstrated to me as a child that I asked him about for years afterward. She paused. He only used it once. What happened? A survey team. The vessel's damaged in an ion storm, and the breach was in the section where 3 of them were still working. He held the hull sealed from outside while they evacuated. She put down the ration pack. He couldn't explain afterward how he'd known exactly which part to hold. He said it was instinct. Maintenance instinct, J1 said. Lyra looked at him. When you've worked on enough systems, he said, you start to feel where the failure point is before the diagnostic catches it. It's not mystical. It's just pattern recognition. But the patterns are physical. Thermal gradients, micro vibrations, the way a seal feels different when it's about to fail. You just know where the hull would break. He ate a piece of something that tasted like compressed grains and industrial cheese. Your father probably had that, differently expressed but the same thing. You are, Lyra said, with a quality in her voice that was not quite wonder. A very odd person to have been chosen for this. I know. I mean that as a compliment. I know that too. On the 6th day, she had him fight the Urame. Not literally fight it. She set the ship's training protocols to active response mode, which meant that the systems he was trying to manipulate were actively trying to reset themselves, the way a real engagement would involve systems that didn't want to be disrupted. It was like arm wrestling with the electromagnetic spectrum. J1 lost repeatedly in ways that were increasingly educational. He learned how to read what the system was doing by what it was trying to undo. He learned that resistance has a direction, and the direction tells you where the system's priorities are, and if you know the priorities, you can work with them instead of against them. It was, he reflected, very similar to working with Chief Rowe. Better, Lyra said after the 4th attempt, when he'd managed to hold a disruptive field stable long enough to actually count. Not good, but better. Story of my career. Does that bother you? He considered it honestly. No, not really. I don't need to be the best at this. I need to be good enough at the right moment. He rolled his shoulder, which ached where the field feedback had impacted the wrong tissue. Good enough at the right moment is how most things actually get done. She was quiet for a moment. Then, my father was the best trained operative his cohort produced. He had 17 years of bureau experience, and he came to a human maintenance station, and a confused jellyfish was the only option he had left. That's not a great advertisement for the bureau. It's not. It's also why I'm here instead of filing reports from somewhere safer. She looked out at the stars through the Uramai's viewport. He came here because he'd followed Vreth for 11 years, and he was dying, and this was what was left. But he also came here, I think he also came here, because he'd tracked the signal pattern on Earth's research network for months, and he'd seen your notes, the ones you filed that nobody responded to. J1 was still, what? The secondary array data. Your notes about the irregular signal. They were in his filed research. He'd been watching you notice things for 3 months before he arrived. She met his eyes. He didn't choose you in the moment. He chose you before he came. J1 sat with that for a long time. The amber light of the Urame's systems made the small space feel like its own contained world. And outside the viewport, the debris field floated in its patient, ancient, slow tumble. And the Earth turned in the middle distance. And somewhere behind all of it was a planet J1 had never seen with a being on it who was already dead and who had, apparently, been watching. He could have told me, he said finally. He was dying faster than he planned for, Lyra said. And perhaps he thought you'd refuse. Would he have been right? She looked at him. Would you have refused? He thought about it. Genuinely, with the honesty that the situation deserved. He thought about every time he'd filed a note that nobody responded to, every system he'd felt going wrong before anyone else had noticed, every moment of that specific loneliness that comes from paying attention in a world that isn't paying it back. No, he said, I wouldn't have refused. Then perhaps, Lyra said, he knew that too. On the 7th day, Vreth arrived. He came with no announcement beyond the station's proximity alarm, which triggered 17 minutes before his flagship dropped out of faster-than-light transit on a bearing that put it between Station Orin and Earth's lower orbit. J1 was in Bay 4 doing a legitimate coolant check when the alarm went off, and he felt the flagship's approach the way you feel the base from a speaker system before you hear the actual sound. A pressure change, a wrongness in the ambient field that his new perception registered before his ears caught the alarm klaxon. He ran. The flagship was massive. J1 had seen it in Kael'var's transmitted memories as a technical diagram. But technical diagrams don't capture mass the way the real thing does. It hung in the station's exterior camera feeds like a piece of the void had decided to have opinions. It was built in the aesthetics of functionality taken past function into something almost brutalist. All hard angles and weapons arrays, no concession to beauty or grace, because Vreth didn't believe in grace, he believed in outcomes. The communication burst came 40 seconds after arrival. It broadcast on every frequency simultaneously, in a language that Jaewon's new perception translated without effort while the station's systems were still recognizing it as a signal. It said, "This station is forfeit. Earth system is designated territory of the Vreth Consolidated Expansion. Organic inhabitants have 12 of your hours to register compliance or be considered hostile assets and processed accordingly." Chief Rowe read the translation that the station system finally caught up with. She was a small, precise woman who had spent 30 years in space engineering and who did not rattle easily. She was quiet for a moment. "Processed accordingly," she said. "Yes," said Jaewon. "What does that mean? Nothing good." He was pulling on his maintenance suit, which was the closest thing he had to appropriate gear, because there was no appropriate gear. "Chief, I need you to do something for me." "Jaewon, what is happening?" "There's a lot to explain and not enough time. I need you to lock down the station and get everyone into the interior modules and seal the bulkheads. I need the external docking arm retracted, and I need the Bay 4 access codes. Those last two things are contradictory. I know. I'll explain later, Chief." He stopped and looked at her because she deserved that. "I'm going to try to do something about this. I don't know if it'll work, but I need you to trust me on the station's lockdown." She looked at him for a long moment, with the face of a person updating a significant amount of information very quickly. Then she picked up the station-wide comm. "All hands," she said. "This is Chief Engineer Rowe, General Emergency, non-drill. Everyone to interior modules, bulkhead seal protocol now. J1, Bay 4 codes are 774 Delta, come back." He went to the bay. Lyra was already there. She had moved the ship. Kael'var's ship, the vessel that the Bureau called a pursuit craft, and which Jaewon had been thinking of privately as the Uremai, because the word had come with the memory transfer, and it meant something like Stormwing. She had moved it from the debris field to Bay 4, while Jaewon was doing the coolant check, because she had felt the flagship coming too. She was standing at the hatch in something that was not armor but suggested armor. The same way Oshark suggests danger without being actively aggressive, and she had a weapon at her hip that Jaewon had seen in her father's memories, and knew, abstractly, was very serious. "He's here," Jaewon said. "I know. The station is locked down. 23 people. I know that too." She met his eyes. "My father chose better than I thought. He chose the only person who was listening." Jaewon pulled on the rest of his kit. "Tell me about Score." Lyra paused, Vreth's second in command. "Why?" "Because Kael'var's records say that Score has filed 3 formal dissents with Vreth in the past 2 years over target selection. He doesn't disagree with the objective. He disagrees with the methodology." Jaewon sealed his wrist rings. "He's not loyal. He's calculating. There's a difference." Lyra watched him. "You read my father's intelligence files, all of them. I had a lot of sleepless nights." He looked at her. "Score won't help us. But he also won't sacrifice the flagship for Vreth if it costs him his own position. That's leverage. That's a theory. I know. I'm full of them." He moved to the Ureme's hatch. "You should stay here." "I will not." "Lyra, my father is dead, and Vreth killed him as surely as if he had done it with his own hands. And I have been in this pursuit for 11 years alongside my father, and I will not stay on a human maintenance station while you go out to face him." Jaewon looked at her. He thought about arguing. He thought about what Kael'var had given him, the full literacy of force and field, and he thought about the fact that what Kael'var's daughter had, by birth and training, was something different. A native fluency that he could never match. "Don't get between me and Vreth," he said. "When it matters, give me the space." She nodded once. They went out in the Ureme. Vreth had sent a forward element. 12 strike units, small and fast and built entirely around the application of concentrated force at a single point, because Vreth's military doctrine, according to Kael'var's files, was essentially overwhelming simplicity. Strike until the target collapses, then administer compliance. He didn't believe in strategy. He believed in mass and momentum. It was a philosophy that had worked on 4 inhabited systems, and those systems were gone now in ways that left no witnesses to argue about methodology. The 12 strike units saw the Ureme immediately. They had obviously been briefed on it, on what it was and what it represented, because their reaction was not the reaction of units encountering an unidentified vessel. It was the reaction of units encountering something they've been told is significant, which is a different kind of attention. They fell into a containment formation that was very good by any standard. Fast, coordinated, no wasted motion. J1 watched it happen on the Uremai's sensors and felt, underneath the fear, a kind of professional admiration. Someone had trained them well. 12, he said. I see them. Lyra's hands were already moving across her console with the fluency of long practice. Their formation suggests they're running on a shared targeting protocol. Disrupt the lead unit's transmission and the others recalibrate independently. They'll lose cohesion for approximately 4 seconds. Can you do that? While you do what? Go somewhere they're not expecting. She looked at him. Where is that? I haven't decided yet. He took the Ureme off the station's bearing and went low and slow and wrong, because everything about the approach geometry that 12 well-trained strike units would be calculating assumed that a pursuit craft would move the way a pursuit craft moves, high, fast, aggressive, exploiting its maneuverability advantage. J1 didn't feel like a pursuit craft. He felt like a maintenance skiff that had accidentally ended up in a firefight, which was approximately accurate, and maintenance skiffs moved low and slow and wrong because they were usually trying not to disturb whatever they were servicing. 3 of the strike units went wide in the first exchange because J1 wasn't where their trajectory calculations expected him to be. He'd gone low and slow when everything about his approach had telegraphed high and fast, and he'd done it because that was what a confused jellyfish would do, and what a confused jellyfish doesn't do is behave predictably. Lyra handled the other 9 with the kind of precise economical authority that told J1 she'd been doing this her whole life. The strike units went dark in pairs, not destroyed. She had very carefully not destroyed them, had instead disrupted their propulsion and left them tumbling, recoverable. He noticed this and thought about it while he brought the Uremai around. The exchange had taken 47 seconds. J1's hands were shaking slightly, and he made himself breathe before he spoke. You didn't kill them, he said. They're soldiers following orders. Vreth is the criminal. Your father had the same protocol. My father taught it to me. Her voice was flat but not cold. There's a difference between the criminal and the instrument. He thought about that while the Uremai's sensors painted the flagship for him. Full crew complement, active weapons systems, one anomalous thermal signature on the command deck that was running significantly hotter than the ambient readings. A system burning itself trying to maintain simultaneous operations, which meant Vreth was doing something besides engaging them. He's broadcasting, J1 said. Lyra looked at the scan. To whom, Scorsho? J1 read the pattern, not the content, the pattern. The way you can tell an argument from a conversation, from the shape of it, even with the sound off. They're fighting. Vreth wants to crack the station now, and Skor is telling him to wait. He ran the tactical math that Kelvar had given him and said quietly, Skor thinks there might be an enforcement asset on that ship. He's identified the Ureme. Lyra went still. Skors knows what the Ureme represents. If he knows the Bureau is involved, destroying the station without completing a proper territorial claim filing becomes a legal problem for him after Vreth is gone. Jaiwan looked at her. He's not protecting the station. He's protecting his eventual ownership of whatever Vreth built. You want to use him. I want to use the fact that he exists. He opened the Ureme's external communication band on the Bureau's enforcement. Frequency, Kaelvar's access codes, still valid because the Bureau didn't know Kaelvar was dead. And he broadcast in the formal register that Kaelvar's files had taught him. This vessel is operating under Interstellar Enforcement Bureau authority, and any destruction of inhabited infrastructure constitutes a Class 4 violation under the Consolidated Systems Accords. There was a pause. Then the command deck's thermal signature changed. Someone on the flagship's bridge had turned toward the communication source. That won't stop Vreth, Lyra said. No, but it'll stop Skor from letting Vreth do it cleanly. J1 set a course for the flagship's main approach vector, which means when we go in, there's a door open. She looked at him with that expression again, the one that was not softening, but was at least no longer hard. You're going to board the flagship. I'm going to try. That's insane. I know. I'm a maintenance worker. He looked at her with what he hoped was more confidence than he felt. I'm very good at getting into places I'm not supposed to be in. He was not being entirely honest about his confidence. His heart was doing something that felt structurally inadvisable. But he had learned, in 4 years of maintenance work, that the time to turn back from a job was before you started it, and if you decided to start it, the fear was just information. It was telling you which parts of the system were the most critical, which failure points to watch, where to put your attention. The fear was useful. You just couldn't let it make the decisions. He flew toward the flagship. If this goes wrong, Lyra said, not looking at him, I want it on the record that my assessment of your combat methodology is that it is unconventional. Is that bureau speak for crazy? It's bureau speak for difficult to predict, which in tactical engagements is often equivalent. That might be the nicest thing you've said to me. Don't make it strange. He didn't make it strange. The approach to the flagship was not the most frightening thing J1 had ever experienced, but it was in the top 3. The flagship filled the Euromai's forward view at a scale that was simply not designed to be human comprehensible. It was the scale of weather, of geological features, of things that exist on a different resolution than individual human experience. It had weapons arrays on its hull that were each larger than Relay Station Orin, and several of them tracked the Euromai as the small ship came in on the maintenance frequency. Kael'var's codes had cracked open. The docking clamp that accepted them was automated. It had been designed to receive Bureau pursuit craft. It didn't know Kael'var was dead. It accepted the codes, ran the verification, and guided the Eurame into a secondary docking bay that was exactly as empty and unguarded as J1 had hoped because the bay was automated and Vreth had pulled his crew to combat stations. Now we move fast, J1 said. The flagship's interior was vast in the way that power is vast, not ornate, not ceremonial, but built to the scale of certainty. Corridors that assumed nothing would ever need to hurry because everything had already been decided. J1 moved through them with Lyra beside him, and the knowledge Kael'var had given him running under his perception like an operating system, painting him a picture of the ship's infrastructure. He could feel the power conduits through the walls. He could feel the weapon systems charging with the patient inevitability of a tide. He could feel, faintly, the particular vibration signature of a being in command, the way authority has a physical presence when it's absolute enough. He found Vreth's command track through the vibration. They had 2 altercations on the way, not with soldiers. Soldiers would have been loud and terminal. They had 2 altercations with security automata, which were worse in some ways because automata don't decide things, they only execute parameters, and parameters don't negotiate. J1 handled the first one in a way that Lyra would later describe as profoundly inelegant, but effective. The second one Lyra handled before he had time to think about it, with a precision that was almost gentle, and it collapsed against the corridor wall in a way that suggested it would probably function again after repairs. You keep not destroying things, J1 said. Things can be repaired, Lyra said. Death is irreversible. He thought about his parents, about the Sung 4. Yes, he said. The command deck was circular, 3 tiers high, built around a central command interface that dominated its environment the way a throne dominates a room, which it was, J1 realized. It was a throne. Vreth had built himself a throne on the bridge of a warship, and he stood at it now, and he was the most physically imposing thing J1 had ever encountered. And he was looking at them both with an expression that combined surprise and contempt in the specific ratio of someone who is surprised at being surprised. Vreth was tall in the way geological features are tall. He was armored in materials that J1's perception identified as ablative composite over a subdermal framework, which meant that the armor was partly him, had been partly him for so long that the boundary had blurred. He had 4 arms, 2 of which held weapons already, and a face that was organized around calculation rather than expression. His eyes, 6, arranged along a brow ridge that extended nearly to his temples, fixed on J1 with something that was almost curiosity. A human, he said. I've been hearing that a lot lately, said J1. Kael'var sent a human. Kael'var gave a human what he needed. There's a difference. J1 stepped forward onto the command deck. He could feel the ship's systems around him, all of them, the full web of it, every conduit and relay and weapons array and life support junction and propulsion coupling. He had been feeling it since they entered the docking bay. He had been mapping it the entire time they moved through the corridors. He was, at his core, a maintenance technician, and a maintenance technician who has been given the ability to perceive systems directly, will, as a reflex, begin to understand what those systems can and cannot do. He understood what this flagship could and cannot do. You destroyed my parents' shuttle, he said. Vreth looked at him. I have destroyed many things. The Daesung 4, 14 years ago. A routine insertion into Earth's orbital research network. 24 scientists, including Dr. Shin and Dr. Shin's wife. There was a pause. Something moved in those 6 eyes. Not recognition, not guilt, but the slightly different quality of a mind accessing an old record. The preliminary survey asset, Vreth said. Your world was already surveyed 14 years ago. This is not new territory. This is claimed territory. You killed 21 people, including my parents, to run a survey that they didn't consent to, in a system they didn't know you were in, so you could plant a flag. Flags are the language of the weak. I plant infrastructure. And yet here you are, J1 said, talking. Vreth moved, not toward J1, or not only toward J1, he moved in the complex, multi-directional way of a being accustomed to engaging multiple targets simultaneously, all four arms deploying in trajectories that would have been overwhelming to a human perceptual apparatus. J1 didn't have a human perceptual apparatus anymore. He had what Kael'var had given him, plus 4 years of maintaining systems under stress, plus 7 days of training in vacuum, plus whatever he'd always had that made Chief Rowe say unreasonably effective in ways that are very difficult to document. He was not faster than Vreth. He was not stronger. He was not by any standard measure as capable. He was, however, aware of every power junction with the flagship's command deck infrastructure, and he understood, with the same clarity with which he understood how to fix a coolant relay with a paperclip, what would happen if 3 specific conduits were interrupted simultaneously while the weapon systems were in active charge cycle. He also understood that doing it would hurt. A lot. He did it anyway. The command deck went to emergency lighting. Not dark, emergency systems are designed for safety, not for drama, but the amber dimness that J1 recognized from Kael'var's ship, a color that meant all non-essential systems, had just been pulled to stabilize the essentials. Every weapons array on the flagship went dark simultaneously, every targeting system, every offensive capability. What remained was life support and basic propulsion and emergency communication, which was what you kept when you couldn't afford to lose anything else. Vreth stopped. In the amber light, with his weapons dead and his targeting systems offline, and his command interface showing him a ship that had suddenly become significantly less powerful than he'd had this morning, Vreth looked at J1 with the first genuine attention he'd paid anything since they'd entered the room. "How?" he said. "Your secondary power coupling on the weapons array runs through the command deck floor junction boxes. You've got a vulnerability where the charge cycle creates a feedback opportunity if 3 specific nodes are interrupted during simultaneous active charge." J1 was bleeding from his left palm where a piece of shrapnel from the junction boxes had gone through his glove. He didn't look at it. It's a design flaw. Your engineers probably know about it. You probably told them to fix it, and they probably said yes and then didn't. Because fixing it requires taking the weapons array offline for 2 days, and you never stay in one place long enough. You're a maintenance worker. I'm a very good maintenance worker. Vreth looked at him, not with contempt now, with something that was as in its way. Worse, the assessment gaze of a mind recalibrating threat level. This does not end this engagement. I have crew. I have resources. You have Score, J1 said, who has already calculated what happens to the expansion project's territorial claims if the Bureau files a counterclaim before your infrastructure is legally registered, and who is currently standing at a secondary command interface on Tier 2, nodded toward the tier without looking, because he could feel the presence there. The thermal signature, the careful stillness of a mind making decisions, and who is, right now, deciding what his loyalty is actually worth. The stillness on Tier 2 changed quality. Vreth turned, slowly, with the deliberateness of someone who already suspects what they'll find. Score was not pointing a weapon at Vreth. He wasn't doing anything as direct as that. He was simply standing with the expression of a calculation that has reached its final line, and the Bureau enforcement frequency was open on the secondary console beside him, and the transmission that had been broadcasting for the last 4 minutes was a territorial claim dispute filing that, under the Consolidated Systems Accords, would freeze all expansion activity in this system pending resolution. Vreth said something in his own language that J1's translation didn't quite catch, but the register of it was clear enough. "You can't kill him here," J1 said. "Not on a Bureau flag channel with an active filing. That's the thing about rules, Vreth. They exist whether you respect them or not. And the people who come after you, and there will be people who come after you, because there are always people who come after, those people will use every filing and every violation and every record, because that's what the rules are for, not to stop you, to document you. Documentation is not force. No, but force has limits and documentation doesn't." J1 looked at him steadily. "You killed my parents to survey a system. You've been here 14 years in the paperwork and not 1 day in person, which means every day you delayed coming here is a day the Bureau's filing window was open. Kael'var knew that. He came here knowing he was dying. He came here to start a clock." Vreth was very still, and the clock, J1 said, started 7 days ago. The silence on the command deck had the quality of held breath. 20 or 30 of Vreth's crew stood at their stations in the amber emergency, light, and none of them were moving. Because the person they were waiting for instructions from was not giving instructions, And the second person in their chain of command was standing at an open bureau channel with an expression of complete composure. Score's voice, when it came, was the voice of someone who has made a difficult calculation and arrived at an uncomfortable but correct answer. Commander, I recommend we stand down pending claims resolution. You recommend, Breth said, with respect. The engagement window has closed. We're now in a documentation period. Score's tone was perfectly measured. Any further action against inhabited infrastructure triggers automatic forfeiture of territorial claims under the Accords. We'd lose the filing, the survey rights, and 14 years of investment. The six eyes moved to J1. The calculation in them was like watching a very large machine decide whether to change course. Not a quick thing, not a light thing. This isn't over, Breth said. No, said J1, it isn't, but you're going to leave. And when you come back, if you come back, there'll be a bureau station in this system, because that's what happens when a claim is disputed. And there'll be documentation, years of it. And every time you blink, it'll get worse. He was bluffing about the bureau station. Lyra's expression beside him said she knew he was bluffing, but the bluff was built on things that weren't false. The filing was real, the Accords were real, and Vreth was the kind of intelligence that wouldn't risk 14 years of investment on the chance that the bluff was hollow. Vreth left, not in defeat. Nothing about it looked like defeat. The flagship disengaged from Station Orin's space with the deliberate patience of something that has chosen to leave rather than been forced to, and there is a difference, and Vreth knew it, and J1 knew he knew it. The strike units were recovered, still functional. The flagship went dark in the FTL registers 40 minutes later on a bearing that Lyra tracked until it was beyond the Urami's sensor range. They sat in the Urami in the debris field, in the silence of open space. That was not what I expected, Lyra said finally. What did you expect? A fight. There was a fight. A different kind. J1 looked at his palm. The shrapnel cut had bled steadily during the exchange and had now dried to a dark stain on the glove material. He pulled the glove off and looked at the hand underneath, the very ordinary human hand, with its 4 joints and its limited range and its bleeding from the inside of the thumb, where the shrapnel had gone, deepest. There was a fight, he said again. It just didn't look like the fights you've seen. Lyra was quiet for a moment. Then, what my father gave you, it was meant for a bureau operative, someone trained for decades, not a maintenance worker. I was going to say someone with standard combat methodology. I don't have standard combat methodology. I have 4 years of learning how things break. He looked at the hand. He didn't choose me because I was the right tool. He chose me because I was the only one listening. That's different. Is it better? He thought about that seriously. I don't know. We're alive. The station is intact. Vreth is filed and documented, and now he has a paper trail that follows him everywhere he goes. He looked up at her. Is that better? I think it's better. I think it might actually be better than killing him. Lyra looked at the space where the flagship had been. He'll come back, probably, with more force, more preparation, less patience. Probably. And Jaewon put his gloved hand back on gently, because the cut was going to need cleaning, and the makeshift pressure was the best he could do for now. And he looked out through the Urama's forward viewport at the Earth below them, the broad blue-white rotation of it, the particular way it held light. And next time, he said, I'll have had more than 7 days. She looked at him. He looked at the Earth. My father trusted you, she said. Your father trusted me more than I deserved. I'm not sure that's true. She was quiet. He was a good investigator, but he was not always a good judge of people. He trusted too quickly. He trusted a maintenance worker with the survival of a planet. He trusted a person who was listening when no one else was. She said it without softness, as a fact. That is not nothing. Jaewon sat with that for a moment. He thought about Chief Rowe, who was currently locked in the interior modules of Station Orin with 22 other people, all of them waiting to find out if the world was still theirs. He thought about Dr. Who was on the ground below, probably in the kitchen with 3 experiments runnings, not knowing that the last 14 years had been the long tale of a decision someone made about his friend's family. He thought about Bomi, who has a son now, a small, energetic boy who Jaewon visited when he was on leave and who called him Uncle Jay with the complete unself-consciousness of children and who had no idea. He thought about a shuttle called the Daesung 4 and the smell of synthetic wool and motor oil. He was a good father, he asked. Lyra was quiet for a long time. The Earth turned below them with its blue patient weight. He was not always there, she said. The work. You understand. She paused. But when he was there, yes, he was a good father. Mine too, said Jaewon. They went back to the station. The docking sequence was automatic and quiet, and when the airlock cycled open, the crew was waiting. Not in any organized fashion. They had been locked in the interior modules for hours, and the lockdown had been lifted 20 minutes ago when the flagship disappeared from the station's sensor range, and they had assembled in the main corridor with the collective energy of 22 people who have been very frightened and are now trying to figure out what they are instead. Engineer Park, 40 years of orbital stations behind him, and a face that had learned to make no claims it couldn't back up, was at the back of the corridor with his arms crossed. Navigator Song was near the front, clutching her monitoring tablet with both hands. Technicians Juan, Minji, and the newcomer Bake were clustered just inside the airlock ring with the body language of people who genuinely cannot decide if this situation calls for relief or awe. Chief Rowe was at the airlock door. She looked at his hand first, then at the rest of him, then at Lyra, standing one step behind him, with the careful spatial awareness of someone entering an environment that has its own social physics and choosing to observe before participating. Then Rowe looked back at him. The flagship is gone? She said yes. For good? For now. With a legal problem attached to it that'll take years to resolve. He looked at the crew, all 22 of them. We're okay. The station is okay. The planet is okay. For today. A pause. Then Engineer Park, who communicated mostly in grunts and silences and had spent 4 decades seeing unexpected things in space without much comment, said, I knew that secondary array data was something. I said 2 years ago that secondary array data was something. Navigator Song looked at him. You filed it as equipment artifacts. I said it was probably equipment artifacts. Probably. That's not the same as saying it was something. It is, if you know how to read a probably. He uncrossed his arms. In 40 years, I've filed 100 things as probably this or that. Every one of them where I said probably turned into something eventually. Ask anyone who's worked with me long enough. Song opened her mouth. Chief Rowe made a single small sound. Song closed her mouth. Park had the grace to look briefly self-aware. The point, Rowe said, is that several of us were paying attention. That's worth something. She looked at her crew and then at the viewport behind them, at the empty space where the flagship had been, the stars patient and indifferent behind it. It's worth a great deal. She looked at J1. Bayfor first aid kit. Then you're going to sit down and talk. All of it. All of it, he agreed. This is Lyra? She looked at Lyra directly. Yes, Lyra said. Bureau Marshal's daughter, you filed the enforcement claim. Yes, good. Rose's tone was the tone of a person filing a fact in a folder marked important but not urgent. There's a cot in secondary storage and the station runs at 3 meals a day. You're on the regular roster until further notice. She looked back at J1. Bayfor. He went to Bayfor. He cleaned the cut with the station's standard medical supplies, which were adequate and unglamorous, and he wrapped it with the bandage that was designed for industrial injuries, and not for shrapnel wounds, but was the right size. He sat on the equipment locker and looked at his hands. Both of them, the wrapped one and the unwrapped one. And he thought about the weight of what Kael'var had put in him. Not a burden, exactly. More like a new floor to a room he'd always lived in. The room was still his. It was just taller now. Lyra found him there 20 minutes later. You're going to have scars, she said. She had found the station's guest quarters, technically the secondary storage module, which had a cot because Chief Rowe had put one there against regulations because sometimes people got hurt and needed to lie down without being moved, and she had cleaned up, and she looked, for the first time since he'd found her on Kael'var's ship, like someone who had stopped bracing for immediate disaster. Probably, he said. The energy transfer scarred my father too. All Bureau operatives. It's a cost of what the ability does to the tissue structure. That's fine. He looked at the wrapped hand. Scars are documentation. She looked at him with something that wasn't quite a smile. Her face didn't arrange itself into smiles the way a human face would, the muscles serving different functions, but was its functional equivalent. It changed the air in the room slightly. It was, he thought, a very honest expression. The filing will take standard months to process, she said. The Bureau will send a representative. They'll want to speak with you. I'll be here. They'll want to discuss the transfer, the ability. Protocol says it should be. She stopped. Should be what? Returned. Or annulled. You're not a Bureau operative. The transfer wasn't authorized by the standard process. Jaewon looked at her. Can they do that? Technically, there's a procedure. And I will tell them that the transfer occurred under emergency field conditions, and that the operative who performed it is deceased, and that the AS subsequently employed the transferred ability to prevent a Class 7 expansion event in a non-registered system, and that without the transfer, the outcome would have been a planetary claim forfeiture with an estimated 40% population reduction. She met his eyes. I will tell them exactly what happened. and I will note in the formal record that my father chose you with full knowledge of what you were, and that his judgment in my assessment was correct. He looked at her for a moment. That's a very formal way of saying you think I should keep it. It's the accurate way. She paused. I think you should keep it. Yes. Because of the maintenance? Because of the listening. She looked at the viewport, at the stars. My father spent 11 years looking for someone who would hear what he was transmitting. He was dying and he had one chance, and he chose the person who was paying attention when the data said something didn't fit. She looked back at him. That's not the transfer. That's you. J1 sat with that. Outside the viewport, Earth continued to turn. The sun was coming up on the Korean peninsula below. He could see the particular quality of early light over the yellow sea, the texture of cloud cover over the mountains, the glittering sprawl of city lights being overtaken by dawn. Down there, Dr. Was probably awake by now, because he was always awake before dawn, and he was probably in the kitchen, and the experiments were probably running, and the smell was probably solder and noodles and warm dust. Jae-won thought about calling him. He thought about what he would say. He thought about the part where he would have to explain that the plane crash that had killed his parents had not been a structural failure, and about the part where he would have to explain why that had been kept from him, and about the part where he would have to explain what he knew now, and what he could do now, and what he had done 6 hours ago in the command deck of an alien flagship with a bleeding hand and a bluff built on rules. He thought he would probably call tomorrow. There was time. The filing was in. The clock was running. Vreth was somewhere in the dark between systems, calculating, and whatever he was calculating would take longer now that the documentation existed, and the Bureau would come, and the slow machinery of accountability would turn. We should sleep. Yes, said Lyra. There's a second cot in the storage module. It's not great. I have slept in worse. Have you slept at all in the last week? She was quiet for a moment. No. Then go, he stood. The hand throbbed with a clean, honest pain that was nothing he couldn't work with. Tomorrow, we start the report. All of it. Everything Kaelvar had, everything that happened, everything about the survey and the Desung 4 in the 14 years. All of it documented and filed, and on record. He looked at her. That's how this works now. Documentation, she said. Documentation, he said. It's not force, but it doesn't stop. She looked at him for a long moment with those copper-dark eyes. Then she nodded, once, and went to the cot. J1 stayed at the viewport. Below him, the sun was coming up over East Asia, over the peninsula, over the city where Dr. was awake in his kitchen, over the schools, and the hospitals, and the construction sites, and the fish markets, and the 10,000 ordinary lives that had come within 12. Hours of being defined as hostile assets to be processed accordingly. The sun came up on them the way it always did, with complete indifference to what it was illuminating. Because the sun doesn't know what it's illuminating, it just rises, and the world below it goes about the ordinary, enormous work of being alive. J1 pressed his wrapped hand flat against the cool composite of the viewport. He held it there and looked out. The stars were still visible on the dark edge of the horizon, the same stars that were someone's coordinates, someone's map, the landmarks by which empires measured their territory. His parents had looked at those stars, had spent their lives studying the signals that came from them, had died because something had looked back and decided they were useful, or inconvenient, or simply incidental, the way a survey team decides that the birds in the field are incidental to the survey. He was going to make sure that the next time something looked back, it saw a record, it saw a filing, it saw a species that had learned, the hard way and too young, that the universe had bureaucracy the same way it had physics, not as a kindness, not as a protection, but as a fact, and facts could be used. He was a maintenance worker. He was unreasonably effective in ways that were very difficult to document. He was going to change that last part. The sun finished rising. The station turned in its orbit. Somewhere in the debris field, the Urame sat dark and cold, waiting, a storm wing folded. Jaewon went to write the first report. He had a lot to say. 6 months passed in the way that months pass when you're working. In layers, each day adding sediment to the one before, until you look back. And there's a stratum of time that could only have been assembled slowly. Chief Rowe released the incident report on a need-to-know basis to the Korean Aerospace Institute, the UN Space Authority, and 3 government bodies that Jae-won hadn't previously known existed. The response from those bodies was measured and careful and deeply frightened in the way that official responses are when they've been frightened into professionalism. Nobody panicked. Nobody decided that the appropriate response was to run weapon systems to the outer system, which was what Jae-won had privately worried about. Mostly they asked questions and formed committees and began, slowly, the work of understanding what the last 14 years had actually been. J1 attended 6 briefings in the first 2 months. He answered questions with the same care he gave to maintenance reports. Completely, precisely, without embellishment, and with clear notation of where he was uncertain. The government bodies were most interested in the Daesung 4 and in the 14-year survey period. The Aerospace Institute was most interested in the Urame and what its technology implied. The UN Space Authority was most interested in the Bureau and in what a formal enforcement relationship with an interstellar regulatory body would look like in practice, which was a question that Lyra could answer and that Jaewon could not. So he referred those questions to her. She answered them with thoroughness and without impatience, which impressed him. He had expected that dealing with human bureaucracy would exhaust her. Instead, she approached it the way she approached everything, with the systematic attention of a person who has decided that this is the work, and the work is what matters. You're good at this, he told her, after a particularly long debrief with a 7-person panel from 3 different agencies. My father was not good at it, she said. He trusted that the evidence would speak for itself. Evidence doesn't speak. People speak for evidence. I learned that watching him lose cases he should have won. That's practical. Enforcement work requires practicality. You can't protect systems you can't communicate to. She was reviewing the debrief recording on the Urama's console, flagging points she wanted to follow up on. Your Chief Rowe is very good at this as well. She's good at everything. She filed a formal commendation for you with the KI. In it, she described your performance as unreasonably effective in ways that are no longer difficult to document. Jaewon was quiet for a moment. Then she changed the last part. Yes, she didn't tell me. She filed it the day after the incident, when you were asleep. She said you would have objected. Lyra did not look up from the console. She was correct. He thought about Chief Rowe, about the way she had handed him the Bay 4 access codes without hesitation, knowing less than she wanted to know. Trusting him anyway, because 4 years of watching him work had told her something she couldn't document and didn't need to. He thought about all the things that people carry for each other that aren't formal and aren't documented and don't make it into any record. And he thought that maybe that was the thing that Kael'var had felt from 43 light years away when he was filtering through signals of a planet he'd never visited. Not just someone paying attention. Someone being trusted by people who paid attention too. He filed a commendation for Chief Rowe in the KI system. It described her decision to lock down the station immediately, without full information, as the single most consequential act of the entire incident, because if the crew had been at external stations when Vreth arrived, the calculation would have been different. He meant every word. She sent him back a message that said only, about time. Now fix the coolant calibration in Bay 3. It's been reading 0.4 degrees high for 2 weeks. He fixed the coolant calibration in Bay 3. The station returned, over the following months, to something that resembled its previous rhythms, with a significant difference that everyone on the crew now knew things they hadn't known before, and were in the process of deciding what those things meant. Engineer Park, the oldest crew member, who had been on orbital stations for 40 years and had cultivated a comprehensive indifference to being surprised, announced that he was retiring in 6 months and taking a position with the KI's new Alien Contact Research Division. Navigator Song, who was 26 and had joined the station 18 months ago with a fresh certification and an enthusiasm for deep space, monitoring that her colleagues had found faintly embarrassing, came to Jaewon's maintenance bay 3 weeks after the incident and sat down on an equipment locker and looked at him with the expression of a person who has made a large decision and is announcing it. I want to learn, she said. Whatever you're learning, whatever Kael'var gave you, not the ability itself, I know that's not how it works, but the work around it, the monitoring, the analysis, the signals. She met his eyes. I was the one who noticed the relay variance in the secondary array the night of the incident. Before the alarm went off, I was about to file a report. I know, Jaewon said. I saw the draft in the system log. You saw it. 3 days before the incident, you started a monitoring subroutine on the secondary array that caught 14 anomalous readings. You filed 8 of them and marked the other 6 as probable atmospheric interference. He looked at her. 2 of those 6 were from the Urami's passive signal. Song was very still. You're saying I found it. I'm saying you were paying attention. He picked up the work order he'd been processing. Come back tomorrow morning, early, and bring your signal analysis notebook. She came back. She brought the notebook. There were others, over the months that followed. Small conversations in maintenance bays and break rooms in the station, single cramped common area, people who had been doing their jobs for years and had been quietly noticing things and not knowing what to do with noticing. The station had 23 crew members, and after the incident, it turned out that approximately 8 of them had been, in various ways and at various levels of rigor, tracking anomalies that they hadn't known were connected. Engineer Park had a 3-year log of irregular frequency events that he'd been writing up as equipment artifacts. Navigator Song's monitoring subroutine was more sophisticated than she'd let on. Even Chief Rowe had a handwritten list, kept in a desk drawer, of 11 separate occasions over 4 years when the secondary array had produced readings that she couldn't explain and had categorized as maintenance issues to investigate later. J1 sat with that list for a long time. "How long have you had this?" he said. "Since the second year," Rowe said. "I didn't want to file it officially because I didn't have enough to make a case. It's not the kind of thing you want in a report if the conclusion is going to be, 'I don't know.'" She looked at the list with the expression of someone seeing a thing they've held privately for a long time from a new angle. "I suppose the conclusion wasn't 'I don't know.' The conclusion was something is here and hasn't announced itself yet. Would you have filed it if I'd asked you to?" She looked at him. "A year ago? Probably not. We'd have talked about it. I'd have asked for more data, and it would have gone into a longer review cycle." She folded the list. "Now? Now I'm asking." She handed him the list. He incorporated it into the formal incident report, with Rowe's permission, with full attribution and a note that the station's informal monitoring culture had contributed materially to the outcome. He sent it to all 7 agencies that had received the original report. He then spent 3 hours writing a supplementary document that made the case, quietly but clearly, that the most valuable thing Relay Station Orin had done in its operational history was maintain a crew that paid attention to things that didn't fit and told each other about what they saw. He sent that supplementary document, unsolicited, to the director of the KI's Human Space Monitoring Initiative, who had been appointed 6 weeks after the incident, when the initiative had been created in response to the incident, and who had been described in the announcement as a distinguished administrator with extensive institutional experience, which was the kind of description that told you almost nothing useful. The director wrote back within 48 hours. Her name was Dr. Yoon, and she had apparently read the entire supplementary document because her response addressed 4 specific arguments from 4 specific paragraphs, and it ended with, "I'd like to speak with you and your crew when time permits. I'm particularly interested in what you mean by monitoring culture and how you would propose to formalize it without destroying it." Jaewon thought that was an excellent question, he replied within the hour. Lyra stayed. He hadn't quite expected that. She had made her bureau report, and she had received, in return, a transmission that Jaewon wasn't privy to, and that left her expression unreadable for the better part of a day. Then, she had told him that the Bureau's formal investigation team would arrive in approximately 8 months, and that until their arrival she was assigned as the Bureau's resident observer in this system, and that her operational base would be Relay Station Orin. "You don't have to stay on the station," Jaewon said. "You could be on the surface, Doctor. Flat is large enough." "I'm not comfortable in gravity wells," Lyra said. "Have you spent much time in them?" "The Bureau's platforms are all orbital. We could start small, a weekend." She looked at him with the expression he'd come to recognize as calculation that was considering an emotional variable it didn't have a category. "For perhaps," she said, which for Lyra was approximately equivalent to enthusiasm. He had called Dr. 3 days after the incident, when the reports were filed and the station was back to normal operations, and Jaewon had slept for 14 hours and eaten an actual meal. He'd called from the station on a private line, and Dr. had answered with the particular voice of someone who has been worrying. He told him everything, all of it, the Daesung 4 and what Vreth had done, and why the official report had said structural fatigue when it hadn't been structural fatigue. Dr. Was quiet for a very long time. Then he said, in the voice of a man who has spent years of his life doing science in the faith that the universe was bigger than anyone had confirmed. "I knew it wasn't structural. They built those hulls correctly. I signed off on the specs." "I know," said Jaewon. "I know you did." Another long silence. "Then are you all right?" "Yes," Jaewon said. "The hand. You heard about that." The Kai report mentioned it, vaguely. A pause. "Your father," Dr. said slowly, "would have been very interested in what you've described. His research was about signal detection, deep space communication patterns, yes." Another pause, longer. "He always said there was something in the noise, that the interference patterns in the outer system readings weren't random. I told him he was extrapolating. Doctor. Voice was rough at the edges in the way of old men carrying long regrets. He was right. He was listening, J1 said. That's what he taught me, without even meaning to. Dr. Was quiet for a while after that, then, come home when you can. Shadal asks about you. He wants to know if you've actually seen an alien. Tell him yes. Tell him she's annoying and extremely competent. A sound that might have been a laugh. I'll tell him. Come home soon, Jay. He went home for a week in the third month, Doctor. Flat had not changed except for a new experiment on the kitchen counter that involved a suspension medium and a set of probes that J1 didn't ask about. Shadal was in university now and came home for dinner, and sat across the table with wide eyes and kept starting sentences that trailed, often to questions too large to ask. Bomi brought her son, who was 4, and the boy climbed on J1 with the complete territorial confidence of children who have decided you are theirs. He sat at the table with the warm, familiar smell of solder and noodles and thought about his parents. Not with grief exactly. Grief had settled into something quieter and more permanent over the years, but with the sharp, clear awareness of what they had given him. The listening. The habit of paying attention when the data said something didn't fit. He told Shadal, when the boy was asleep and they were washing dishes, I'm going to need people. Shadal looked at him. For what? For the work. For what's coming. The Bureau is a good system, but it's not a human system, and we need people who understand both. He passed a dish. You're studying astrophysics. Aerospace engineering. Close enough. Think about it. Shadal was quiet. Then, is it like what you'd imagine? What I'd imagine. Space. Being out there. Is it like you'd imagine? J1 dried the dish. He thought about the debris field in amber light, and the Uremi's handling, and the blue-white of Earth from the Uremi's viewport, and Vreth's 6 eyes recalculating, and Lyra's expression when she was deciding something, and the way the sun came up over the yellow sea when you were high enough to see the whole coast at once. Better, he said, and worse in different ways than you'd expect. Shadal nodded slowly. I'll think about it. He went back to the station. The Bureau team arrived in the 7th month, 5 investigators in a vessel that was larger and considerably better appointed than the Urememe, flying under formal Bureau designation with all the documentation Lyra's report had generated as part of their briefing package. They were individually very professional and collectively very careful with J1 in the specific way of institutions that have encountered something outside their standard protocols and are deciding whether it's a problem or a resource. The senior investigator was named Orvith. He was not Vreth's species. J1 had worried about that, briefly, and then felt ashamed for worrying. But a different kind of being entirely, smaller and quicker, with iridescent patches at the temples that moved when he was thinking. He had been with the Bureau for 40 years. He had read Kael'var's files. He had read Lyra's report. He had read J1's report, all 37 pages of it, including the appendices on the Daesung 4 and the 14-year survey period and the specifics of Vreth's flagship's power coupling vulnerability, which J1 had included, because documentation meant documentation, not just the parts that were flattering. He met J1 in the station's main operations room, which was not a meeting room but was the largest available space, and he sat across a folding table and looked at J1 for a while with those iridescent temples moving steadily. You filed a counter-territorial claim, he said. Yes, using a deceased Bureau Marshal's credentials. The credentials were still active. I verified before using them. That's not, he stopped, considered. That's technically accurate, I know. You also deployed Bureau Enforcement Authority verbally during an active engagement with a Class 7 aggressor, based on those credentials. Yes. And you documented a power coupling vulnerability in Vreth's flagship that our technical analysis team says is accurate, and which is now part of the active case file. I figured it was better in the record than not. Orvith looked at him. We have a question about the ability transfer. Lyra told me. The transfer was not authorized. There's a standard protocol. Kael'var was dying with minutes remaining and one chance to start a clock that would give this planet a legal foothold before Vreth filed an unchallenged territorial claim. J1 met his eyes. I don't think he was thinking about protocol. No. The iridescent patches moved. He was thinking about the work. Yes. A long pause. Then, the work continues to need doing. Yes, said J1. There are 2 other systems in this sector where Vreth's pre-survey activity suggests active preparation. We will need resident assets in both. We will need people who understand the intersection of human and Bureau methodology. The patches moved again. We are, institutionally, very short on those. J1 thought about Shadal, washing dishes, asking if it was like you'd imagine. I know some people, he said. Orvith looked at him steadily. The ability transfer, we're leaving it in place. Lyra's report, Lyra's report, and your report. And 37 pages of documentation that frankly made our legal team briefly emotional. He stood up. Welcome to the Bureau, J1. Pending formal credentialing, which, given the circumstances, may take some time. I'm patient, said J1, so we understand. A pause. Kael'var chose well. Kael'var chose the only person who was listening. Orvith looked at him. In a universe this loud, he said quietly, that is not a small thing. He left to speak with his team. J1 stayed at the folding table in the operations room and looked at his hand, the one with the scar now fully healed into a clean ridge across the palm, the one he'd pressed against the viewport the night after Vreth left. He thought about his father, who had spent his career pointing instruments at the sky and listening to things that didn't fit. He thought about his mother's coat, synthetic wool, and motor oil, the smell of a person who never stopped working even on her day off. He thought about Dr. In the kitchen with the experiments running. He thought about Lyra, asleep in the storage module, the first time she'd slept in a week, the expression on her face when she was deciding something difficult. He thought about a confused jellyfish that could still sting. He picked up the new report form that Orvith's team had left on the table. The Bureau, S standard intake form, 43 pages, triple system filing, cross-referenced to the Consolidated Systems Accords. And he pulled out the pen he always kept in his chest pocket, the cheap one with the chewed cap that Chief Rowe had mocked him for on multiple occasions, and he put it to the first line. He started filling it out. He had, it turned out, a great deal to document. And somewhere between the stars, in the cold dark between systems, was running his calculations and finding each time that the math was more complicated than it had been, that the system he had surveyed 14 years ago and filed for claim and planned to take on his own schedule had developed, in his absence, a paper trail, a record, an accumulating mass of documentation that didn't stop and didn't sleep and didn't need to be faster or stronger than him to be effective. It just needed to be there, filed and cross-referenced and attached to his name in every registry that mattered. Documentation is not force, he had said. No, but force has limits, and documentation doesn't. The station turned in its orbit. The Earth below it caught the light. Somewhere in the inner system, the Urame waited, Stormwing folded, the first human-piloted Bureau asset in a sector that was going to need many more of them before the work was done. J1 filled in the forms. He was very good at it.